First respondent is going to be Professor Angela McRobbie. Angela is, of course, well known as a pioneer within the field of cultural studies, particularly for her work on gender and sexuality, feminism, popular culture, and the fashion industry. Her publications include The Aftermath of Feminism and Be Creative, and her most recent monographs are Feminism and the Politics of Resilience and the forthcoming Fashion as Creative Industry. The next to speak will be Lindsay Balfour. Lindsay employs an intersectional feminist and cultural studies perspective in relation to the role of digital and artificial in everyday life. And her current research draws on the relationship between femtech or feminine technologies, where she's studying surveillance capitalism and embodied computing, including the concept of tracking through wearable, implantable, and ingestible tech. And Lindsay's publications include the monograph Hospitality in a Time of Terror, which sadly over the last couple of weeks has become more relevant than ever, I'm afraid. And Adrian Evans's research explores the ways in which gender organizes personal, social, intimate, and cultural relationships. It focuses on stories of intimacy in the context of a post-feminist sensibility. And her books include Technologies of Sexiness, which I showed earlier, and Post-Feminism and Health. Angela, I'm going to hand over to you first.
Thank you very much, Jackie. I'm just checking my sound. You can hear me okay?
Very good, yeah, great.
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to keep my comments short. And I found this a really incredibly stimulating and exciting lecture, in fact, a tour de force. A couple of things that I just want to flag up that kind of shape my response is the presence of Jackie's mother and the situating of her mother in a certain historical context. And her mention that her mother had been ridiculed in her family for her lack of knowledge. And I think that might be something we can come back to. So that's one trope that I want to flag up. And the second trope is the term in relation to Maggie Nelson's novel, where Jackie locates herself within a kind of idea of deferential fandom. And I think that again is a very telling and a rich kind of experience that is worth some further consideration. So they're the 2 points that I want to particularly flag up. Now I'm going to kind of rush through my notes as quickly as possible. Okay, so thank you for this wonderful and provocative and provoking lecture. There is a wide sweep across the decades, across generations of feminist scholars, and across the disciplines. There is a non-nostalgic look to past works, which boldly and bravely set out to restore aspects of personal experience so as to make those elements visible and apparent in scholarship, and indeed that were to become formative of the scholarship. Obviously, I'm thinking of the work cited earlier by Valerie Wokadine, by Caroline Steedman, and by Jill Spence. Much of this early work drew, as Jackie does, and I think this marks the continuity that Jackie is making a claim for, of the value of psychosocial and psychoanalytical perspectives. The idea also, however, that works its way through the lecture is, I think, and one that was always very important in cultural studies, of history from below, of invisible lives, of perhaps also, although she didn't mention the words, but there were echoes there to me also of the memories of the idea of working class culture or of women's working class culture in its domestic and feminized clothing or guise, women's disappointment, women's anger and fury and vulnerability. Of course, Lauren borrows Raymond Williams' notion of structure of feeling, but I also always heard in Berlant's work resonances and echoes of Richard Hoggart's notion of voice and gossip and the way women talked and the importance he placed on that, giving it, honoring it, and giving it a place in culture and history. So I think the two thematics that emerge through Jackie's lecture are the value of the psychosocial and the impersonal in an autobiography, and also the idea still of history from below, of subjugated voices. The lecture to me traverses works which have gone beyond the more usual parameters of interdisciplinarity. There are references to autobiography, to auto theory, to film, to fiction, to queer theory, and these are held together throughout with the notion of narrative. So narrative also functions in the lecture to provide this kind of historical and cultural continuity. It's a formal device. However, what is most interesting about the narrative here is that it is open-ended. It's a formal device that creates spaces, and I'm interested in those spaces of address, in the spaces of the audience, the spaces to the student, the spaces to the colleague. And this seems to me also to be something that defines the formal element of Jackie's lecture. Or let me put this another way. The lecture both enacts and simultaneously advances as an argument the potential political power of open-ended narrative and its relational spaces. In some ways, they're almost like Homi Bhabha's third spaces, but the idea of a third space, I think, also is kind of haunting in the overtones of the lecture. Drawing on Berlant, Jackie uses the idea of femininity as genre, as something that is entered into. And this is an incredibly useful way, I think, of understanding femininity as a psychic and as a kind of a way of being, as something that draws on certain repertoires that are pre-given. And here I'm thinking again about the voice of the mother, the voice of the aunties, the voice of the relatives that Jackie referred to right at the start in quoting Berlant. And these as being more or less undocumented voices and also undocumented outpouring. So I think this is where Lauren Berlant and Jackie sort of join together to reinstate and to really dissect these kinds of voices. But the step then that Jackie takes, which I think is most important, is the step into impersonality, which again, I think she uses Christopher Hayne to make the case that impersonality can be an incredibly important way of reading that which seems personal. And she does this again also through Denise Riley's post-structuralist understanding of language as a pre-given, as something we enter into that gives us the illusion of mastery and control, but that there is also spaces available to deconstruct that mastery, to decenter that mastery. And again, I think that's what you're pointing to, that open-ended narrative has got an autobiography, has got within it, through your idea of veracity, authenticity, different accounts, it's also got the potential to show that the I is indeed illusional. And that's an incredibly important, I think, and significant kind of turning point. Okay, well, I'm just going to finish off by going back to the tension, which is a tension I completely agree with Jackie's notion of impersonality and narrative and autobiography as set against the work of Maggie Nelson. And however, as a kind of aside and as a kind of, as a kind of, hinted, or below the text, if you like, a subtext, you mentioned the idea of deferential fandom to Maggie Nelson. And I'm just like wondering what is at stake in this deferential fandom that you kind of stop yourself from having. You both have it and you don't have it. And it seems to me that that deferential fandom points to a certain kind of feminist and queer need, a kind of desire, a space of desire, and a kind of hunger for certain kinds of works. And one finds it both, it responds both to queer hunger, but also to a quite conventional heterosexual hunger. If you think of the same kind of need, the same kind of fandom accompanies the work of Elena Ferranti, for example, and her notion of friendship. So I'd like you to kind of maybe comment a little bit more in the questions about the need for a kind of feminist queer state of just having that hunger met, having it made me think about Barthes' notion of jouissance, or of being blissed out by the narrative. So to conclude my horribly, I'm sorry, rambling comments, and I would like to pitch in just with the kind of change of epistemology, the change of paradigm here, which is both a change, but you've shown there is a continuity. And I think that that is best exemplified also in the work of Saidiya Hartman's fabulations, that there are different ways of recording, documenting, different ways of doing reparative work, other than those that are found within the rather hubristic field of auto theory, as demonstrated by Maggie Nelson. So thank you, Jackie.
Thanks so much, Angela. That was incredibly rich in itself. The idea of us responding in a group like this is so that Jackie can choose the responses that she feels she wants to, the impact on her the most, and she feels she wants to pick up on. Yes, so I'm going to hand over to Lindsay now. Lindsay, are you ready?
Yeah, I am. Okay, I'm going right away. Yeah, again, I will just echo what Angela said. Thank you so much for your talk. I will also try to keep my comments brief, but these ideas are really so exciting and instructive for me. My motives are slightly selfish and ulterior here, as your talk has sort of intensified some questions that I've been trying to think through for a while now. So it's nice to now do that, not in solitude. And like Angela, I'm interested in this recognition of invisible lives and the psychosocial dynamic of that, though perhaps in a slightly different way. If you'll forgive me for perhaps adding an other here. But again, like Angela, I want to sort of draw on maybe two threads in my comments. One is this idea of intimacy and the risks of autobiography, or the risks of intimacy. And the other is this notion of others' lives written through our own. And I will try to tie these together, perhaps maybe with a bit of a nod to method, in fact. And something we've been discussing a lot in our reading group around the research theme that Gary referenced in his intro as post-digital intimacies. And something that I've been sort of struggling with is this idea of intimacy as most often seen as this kind of possibilizing or constructive thing, a way of building or affirming effective community, and in general, something to be desired, as though intimacy itself is kind of coterminous with ethics. And this is only part of what intimacy does. And it's also often about the mess and the conflict as much as the positive. So I really appreciate your acknowledgement right away of, I think you called it the emotional thorniness of it all. And you spoke early on about how we're drawn into the intimacy of the autobiographical without anything personal being disclosed. And I'm really struck by this realization that in many ways, this is not a choice, but a kind of an interpolation on many fronts. Or as you quoted, I think from Riley a bit later, apologies if I get this wrong, something about the business of being named and taking on a social category. And so the intimate here is brought to the fore by virtue of inhabiting a particular femininity or a particular body that culturally has always kind of registered as part of the public domain. Whether this is an expectation of disclosure, as you spoke of, or brought on by the conventions of the genre itself, either way, I'm always tempted to push things to the other edge of intimacy, this kind of, I guess, dark twin of the promise of effective community, which is the possibility of betrayal or appropriation, non-consent or exposure, and maybe even violence. And so autobiography and auto-theory for me are an occasion to sort of write and think oneself into that risk rather than into a kind of stability or surety. And also, as you point out near the end of your talk, and this kind of maybe slides into my second point, autobiography is also an occasion to write and think others through ourselves into that risk. And it tempts me, I think, to return maybe to some of your other works and the ideas that you bring forth, maybe in Thinking Through the Skin or even the cinematic life of the gene, to make sense of this sort of tension around theories of intimacy versus its lived and often dangerous experience. And perhaps this is at the fore of our sociality now more than ever. And in particular, I'm reappreciating the biological metaphors that ripple through your work. And they didn't come up necessarily in explicit ways, but implicit for me throughout, this idea maybe of the genetic imaginary as a boundary that connects, but also disassociates us from others. And now thinking through these new biological intimacies, both willed and unwilled, alongside our renewed obsession with health and immunity, cleanliness, and contact tracing. And as of late, it strikes me that we're much more concerned with actual material touch than theories of relationality, but they're all bound together, aren't they? Just as skin is a thin, impermeable sort of membrane designating a boundary between self and other, and just like skin contact opens up this entire world of relational possibilities, from sex to harm to transfusion to contamination, I think so too we can think about autobiography perhaps as porous, in the sense of allowing other lives to be written through our own. Avery Gordon talks about this as a kind of haunting as method. Jodi Castricano calls it cryptomimesis or ghostwriting. But this idea of writing the unconscious or the psychosocial through our lives, through our words, through our bodies, for me, it designates an almost kind of like autoimmunitary process where such writing itself is not the mechanism by which we establish boundaries and security, but through which we're actually rendered kind of utterly defenseless. And so for me, when I sort of think through this, I get the sense that it's also this spectral process. So your conclusion here, where you speak of being erased from another story, like a missing person, or I think you use the phrase a structuring absence, to me suggests this kind of haunting, or a hauntology more than an erasure. And so I'll end on those thoughts that are more stream of consciousness than question, but if you wanted to respond to sort of help me and help us think through these narratives of others that are written through us and by us as spectral figures, the return of the repressed, yes, but also the revenant. And I think if autobiography includes this kind of ultimate, unwilled and intimate invasion of another's work or life passing through one's own, and if this passing through is not the very definition of kind of ghostly possession. And maybe this is now a question, to what extent is autobiography and maybe auto theory too, I guess, a kind of ghost story? I'm going to stop there.
Thanks so much. Yeah, Eddie, you go.
Okay. And like Angela and Lindsay, I just wanted to say a big thank you, Jackie, for your talk and for sharing your rich work with us that both unfolds and expands on your previous ideas and gives them new significance, I think. So my own response is shaped by what comes through strongly for me in Jackie's work and in her talk today, which, although includes the writerly practice of the cultural critic or the cultural theorist, also foregrounds attention to the process of reading and of being read. So to give a few examples on what Jackie calls the having already been readness of queer and feminist performance artist Peggy Shaw's Butch Noir, she suggests, to quote, "My vulnerability arises in your capacity to wound me, but my queerness defies this wounding power, since it has already been embraced and incorporated by your derision. Thus you read me, I show you that I have read your reading by reclaiming it. And in reading myself, by refusing your reading of me, I try to get ahead of the game. But just when I think I've done so, I find this rereading has already been reread, if and when I arrive in your future." In your discussion of Maggie Nelson, you align the Winnicottian idea of the good enough mother with the good enough reader, where the good enough mother avoids idealization that allows the child subject to develop. The good enough reader leaves room for ambiguity, ambivalence, and what you refer to as a generative failure. And in Jackie's talk today, Jackie gestures towards the sense of having already been read by Ballant and of the wrongful narration of being misread, or perhaps of not being read at all. So reading and being read are more than the act of actual reading, as in the binary of author-reader or in the analyst reading the text, but in the way subjects are formed, for example, through intelligibility, recognition, misrecognition, and relationality. These concepts have been really important for us in the Centre for Post-Digital Cultures in thinking around the concept of intimacy as more than cozy feelings, but of how reading and being read, seeing and being seen, feeling and being felt, are formed through messy interactions between ourselves, our bodies, and our worlds. And as Jackie's work reminds us, as something that is not always accessible to ourselves. So your talk and the work that you've done previously has drawn my attention to thinking differently about what we mean when we say auto theory writes theory into the fabric of everyday life. To also pay attention to how auto theory is as much about the reading and of the being read. And with that, I will hand over to you, Jackie.
Hi.
Go for it.
Hi. Gosh. They're fantastic responses, and I very much appreciate them. Thank you. I'm aware of the time and people have been listening for a while, so I'm just going to pick out a couple of things and see if anybody else wants to come back in and we can have a bit of a conversation. I can put it on gallery view. First of all, Angela, I really appreciated the point that you made about the hunger, the sort of desire, the hunger, and the way in which not just, I think the idealization of Nelson and the Argonauts, but I think the way in which that was symptomatic of a hunger for something. And I guess Caroline Lavender makes the argument that that is a sort of hunger for the reparative, really, that the text itself articulated a hunger for the reparative. I mean, I can see Caroline there, so she might want to come in, but also a desire for avoidance. And I suppose that's something that you're response gets at is what is the hunger that we bring to auto theory, autobiography, autofiction, and what are the things that we're also trying to avoid in attaching to particular texts. And it may be that Caroline Laubener is right, I think, that this pull of the reparative is an avoidance of something. And I think she's right when she says it's actually an avoidance of the unconscious, and also what that perspective brings, which is the sort of blocks on transparency of self and of other. So so yeah, I think it's interesting to situate the current appeal of auto theory, to situate that in relation to the appeal of the reparative more generally, the appeal of the telling of something to bring a certain kind of resolution or repair. There are many other things I could say as well. And just to respond to Lindsay again briefly, I think you're onto something in wanting to bring together, wanting to think about the risks of certain genres, but wanting to bring together intimacy and ethics, as if intimacy were an ethical, as if the desire for intimacy were an ethical end in and of itself. I think that's right, and I think it's really important, actually. And I think what you were hinting at, perhaps slightly differently from Angela, was the sort of sense of the articulation of the self being some sort of purging, or some sort of cleansing, or some kind of, not just reparation, but arriving in some kind of place where the traumatic, the violent, the aggression, to use a word hasn't been used yet, those can be kind of bracketed away through narration and through narrative articulation. And then I like the reading of the end in terms of haunting rather than erasure. I guess my use of erasure was partly self-mocking. Yeah, but I liked the haunting metaphor. I thought that was helpful. And then finally, Addie, thank you for your response. Something about the way you linked up what I said with my argument in the Butch Noir piece about having already been read. I guess there's something in that piece in which I expressed my admiration for the Butch Noir articulation of having already been read, and how appealing that is. But I think what you're pointing to is right, which was also an ambition of that article, which was to say this is a particular queer genre, but it tells us something about how the subject is constituted in language itself. And when we enter language, we have already been read. And I think your connection between that, and in fact, I nearly used a bit of Peggy Shaw in this talk, and then I had to cut it. But that connection about not just the desire to write the self or write the other, but the pleasures and anxieties about having been read, as you three have all just read me so beautifully. Thank you. Mainly
in the chat is just thanks and gratitude.